Hi everyone, welcome to the Dyslexia and Academic Success Back to School webinar series. The webinar is going to be hosted by me. I'm James Porter. I'm Community Manager here at the Tutor Crowd. I'll be the one asking the questions. The two main presenters are Stephen and Patrick. Both presenters are dyslexic themselves, so we're hoping for a really insightful interactive webinar series from people who've dealt with dyslexia their whole life. Stephen is a published dyslexia author. He blogs at dyslexiawayofthinking.co.uk, and he also hosts the biggest dyslexia group on Facebook as well. Patrick is an ex-teacher and dyslexia tutor, and he's now CEO of the Tutor Crowd. Moving on now to another topic, I want to talk about structure, which I think is something that you're really quite passionate about, Stephen. What's your perspective on dyslexia and structure?
This is an interesting one. Dyslexics work and study in a non-dyslexic environment, and this causes problems. But something we do as dyslexics miss is, I call them the dyslexic study skills, or dyslexic way of thinking skills. But if a dyslexic has a structure of how they do things, from either evaluating themselves or being taught by a teacher, even a non-dyslexic teacher, they will understand the next time or a few times later how to do something. We all have structure, but dyslexics often have the weakness of they don't even know a structure, how to do something. And this can be reading, this can be writing as well, or even working. But if we don't have structure, we have difficulty in doing something. And dyslexics often have had difficulty of not knowing how to do structure because they may have not been taught it, or they forgot it from when they were younger. So I would like to just make a comment to teachers if you're out there, or when you're out there now. If you're giving dyslexics an instruction, it's worth, and you're going to ask them to do some notes on this for maybe homework, why not give the dyslexic or all the students a bit of structure by saying, I would like the notes in bullet point form. What you're telling is you're giving them a structure, and that's important. I would be very interested to hear how Patrick answers this question.
I mean, Stephen, I was agreeing with what you're saying. I think it's important also to emphasise that when a dyslexic writes something, it's clear to them and it's not clear to other people. So because it doesn't have that structure, it's a word salad to the teacher, and it was very clear to the dyslexic saying it. So I would mirror what Stephen was saying, is that structure is absolutely critical, and it's definitely one of the things that we'll be looking at in the next webinar, because without learning some sort of structure, for example, the structure of a typical paragraph, the structure of an essay, the dyslexic's answers are going to be sort of a bit higgledy-piggledy, and that's one of the things a dyslexic must learn and must address at all points when writing.
Okay, thanks Patrick. So we've talked so far primarily about the differences and the difficulties that dyslexics typically face in education, but I'd like now to really focus on some of the strengths. Patrick, creativity, what's your perspective on dyslexia and creativity?
Well, if you think about the process of thinking or the process of understanding something, it's usually there's two different elements. The first element is that you are, say someone is explaining something to you, for example, say a rugby player, you're explaining to a rugby player how American football works. Now, the rugby player can relate a lot of this to past experience and say, okay, instead of throwing the ball backwards, you throw the ball forwards. And so they're relating it to past experience. A dyslexic can't do that a dyslexic can't do that as well as a normal person. And as a result, they have to do more what I call abstract construction. So they're constructing things. They're constructing an abstract picture of this in their brain because they can't relate it to past experience as much as a normal person. this dyslexia has problems with recall, with processing, and with short-term memory. You think, oh my God, this sounds terrible. In a strange way, this is actually a huge benefit, because as a result, dyslexics become very good at creating abstract situations. An example of this is Michelangelo. Now, Michelangelo was not looking at things in the way that people would usually look at things, because he was creating things in his head. This would improve in terms of, this would help an individual be more creative, but it will also help problem solving and thinking outside the box, because the dyslexic is constantly having to think and construct things in an abstract fashion, and therefore over time they become much stronger at doing this. As a result, they can become great problem solvers and creatives like Churchill or Michelangelo, and there are lots of other examples of famous dyslexics who are looking at the world in a different way.
Thanks, Patrick. That's a really interesting answer. Stephen, what's your perspective on dyslexia and creativity?
Creativity in dyslexics is an interesting thing, really. Dyslexics have a great amount of creativity, even if it becomes from sports, the arts. Just asking a dyslexic to solve a problem, they will use their creativity to solve that problem. And as Patrick was saying, it's the strategy and the structure how they solve is creative. And I think very much that dyslexics, and I've said this before, are picture thinkers. But I think this picture thinking is dyslexics can come up with a very creative image within their brain. And then you can say to a dyslexic, if they're very good at art, can you please design me something? And what they'll do, they'll think of what the image in their head, and they will then, if it's paint, they'll then paint it or draw it. And you've got to realise that dyslexics will be very, very creative within their mind, but they might not be able to be great artists. So they can use their creativity in maybe a different aspect, a different method. But I definitely think creativity is one of the biggest strengths that dyslexics have. And dyslexics need to use it to empower their dyslexia. And also, being creative, and especially with being dyslexics, we're very stressed within our study environment. But if you put a dyslexic in an environment where they can use creativity, one, it relaxes them, two, it reduces stress, and three, they're loving being in that environment. That's why you see dyslexics are very good designers, artists, actors and actresses, and anything which uses their creativity.
Thanks, Stephen. I really appreciate the answer. Just finally, that pretty much concludes all the topics for today's webinar. I wondered, in fact, if either Patrick or Stephen have any advice for either the parents or educators out there listening who are thinking, okay, it's great that I need to understand dyslexia, but what can I do to help my child or my student? How can I help them at this stage? What's the advice, Patrick, that you would give right now?
My advice as a dyslexic myself, take it seriously. Take it very, very seriously. This is not going to be a normal process, because a dyslexic is a very different brain to the normal brain. And turn up to all the webinars, turn up to the next webinar and all the webinars, and research it. Research it with us. There's lots of blogs. There's lots of information on Stephen's website, and research it in other places also. What you're going to have to do is kind of find out what works with you, but don't think this is something that's going to fix itself, because at the moment, with a traditional educational system, it's going to be difficult for a dyslexic. It's not going to be impossible. You have dyslexics achieving in a traditional educational environment, but you do need a different approach.
Thanks, Patrick. And any final thoughts from you, Stephen?
Yes, parents, teachers. Okay, teachers, I know that it's very difficult. I know that you can't say to a parent, I think your child is dyslexic, therefore you have to then give the child assessment, and that costs money. So often I know that teachers try to help in other ways. But to answer the question for parents, I know it's difficult. I know it's terrifying that you get told that your child has dyslexia or might have dyslexia. And I always give a few simple tips. One, you need to take action on this. If you don't take action as quickly as possible, and for example, if you find that your child is dyslexic midway through the year, in, for example, January, they've got 5 months to get. You've got 5 months to get a child to increase their reading ability, to understand study skills, so they can actually pass their exams or do better in exams. And if we don't do it earlier on, even earlier as a child, dyslexics will suffer throughout their education. So it's important to take action as quickly as possible. To take action, I would do a number of things. One, as Patrick said, learn about dyslexia as much as you can. 2, find other dyslexic parents and network with them. Ask them how they are doing things, how they are supporting their child. For example, you might actually find that one of your children's best friends is dyslexic, and therefore they have private lessons. So straight away you know a private tutor you can get in contact with. The next issue is dyslexics have a lot of stress, and you need to reduce that stress. We talked about creativity. So either gently pushing the child into doing things which they're creative about, even if they're not very good at it. They might find it fun, and fun reduces stress. And fun enhances self-acceptance. For me, I was never very good at arts, but I was good at one thing. It was golf. I know it's boring, but for me, I got self-acceptance on the golf course because I was able to do something well. I didn't need to do reading and writing. And so getting a child into something maybe different from your other children, if you have other children, so they can actually say, oh, I'm doing something. And again, I would definitely speak to your local dyslexia association or dyslexia action groups to see what support elsewhere is out there, and also get tested for eye fatigue. We're going to put the guys are going to put a link on there who to speak to on that. This is something which will help your child increase their reading ability, and it's always going to be more hurdles, but just keep on pushing and moving ahead.
Thanks, Stephen. That's a great answer.